My name is Audrey, and I am 34 years old. The moment Brandon's hand struck my face, the Christmas dinner table went so silent I could hear someone's fork drop against a plate. 1 second earlier, I had been carrying a tray of warm cider glasses past the crowded dining room, trying not to bump into anyone while everyone laughed, toasted, and pretended we were the kind of family people admired. Then a chair scraped back behind me. Someone stepped into my path, and I lost my balance just enough for my shoulder to brush against Brandon's expensive jacket. A few drops of cider touched his sleeve. That was all. He turned so fast I barely had time to breathe before his palm cracked across my cheek in front of every relative in that room. My skin burned. My eyes watered from the shock, but I refused to cry. Brandon pointed at me like I had destroyed Christmas itself and shouted, "What are you, blind?" No one moved. No one defended me. Elaine rushed toward him, not to check my face, but to dab his sleeve with a napkin. Graham looked at me with a coldness I had spent years pretending not to notice. Then he said, "Apologize to your brother, or get out." I stood there with one hand against my burning cheek, staring at the people I had protected for years while they looked back at me like I was the problem. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply placed the tray down, turned toward the front door, and walked out into the freezing Christmas night. But at 8 o'clock the next morning, I left a package on their doorstep, and what they found inside made every single one of them panic. Before I tell you what was in that package and why my family started calling me non-stop, tell me this. What is the weather like where you are watching from, and does it match your mood right now? I am curious to see how far this story will travel. The cold outside should have shocked me back into emotion, but it did the opposite. The moment I stepped off the porch and heard the front door close behind me, something inside me became still. My cheek was still burning from Brandon's slap, and I could still hear his voice echoing in my head, asking me if I was blind, as if I had not spent most of my adult life seeing every crack in that family and quietly paying to cover them. I walked to my car without turning around. No one followed me. No one opened the door to say they were sorry. No one even called my name. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I drove down the mountain road with Christmas lights disappearing behind me in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in years, I did not feel guilty for leaving them behind. I thought about Graham, the father who had once sat at my kitchen table with both hands covering his face because his construction business had collapsed after a failed luxury resort project. I thought about Elaine, my mother, who had cried into a dish towel and begged me not to let the family become a public embarrassment. I thought about Brandon, the son they had always praised, protected, and excused, even when he was lazy, cruel, and reckless with money that was never his. 5 years earlier, I had saved them. Quietly. Completely. I bought the mountain lodge they were living in, then allowed them to tell their friends that Graham had simply downsized his investments. I paid off the tax liens. I covered the overdue mortgage. I even invested in Brandon's chain of high-end vision clinics because Elaine kept insisting he only needed one real chance to prove himself. She called him gifted. She called him misunderstood. She called me dramatic whenever I asked why his clinics needed another emergency transfer. By the time I reached my apartment in Boston, the pain in my face had faded into something colder and far more useful. I did not go to bed. I did not pour myself a drink. I walked straight into my office, opened the wall safe behind a framed photograph, and took out the documents I had hoped I would never need. The first folder held the deed to the lodge. My name was on it. Only my name. The second folder held the agreement that allowed my parents and Brandon to live there rent-free as long as they respected basic conduct terms. The third folder held the business investment contract for Brandon's clinics, including the clause that allowed immediate review, account suspension, and loan recall if he committed misconduct, fraud, or any act that damaged the reputation of the investor. He had signed it with a smirk, probably thinking I would never use it. Elaine had witnessed the signature. Graham had called it unnecessary paperwork. I placed all 3 folders on my desk, then called Victor. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice calm and alert, the way only a lawyer who had handled family disasters before could sound after midnight. I told him what happened. I told him about the slap, the witnesses, the threat from Graham, and the fact that I had been ordered out of a home I owned. Victor did not interrupt me. When I finished, he asked one question. "Are you ready to enforce the agreements?" I looked at the folders under my hand and felt the final piece of my old life break away. "Yes," I said. "Prepare the notice to vacate. Suspend Brandon's access to every business account tied to my funding. Freeze the company credit cards. Start a forensic audit. And have everything delivered at 8 o'clock in the morning." Victor paused for only a second, then said he would make sure every step was legal, clean, and impossible to twist against me. After the call ended, I sat alone in my office while the city lights blinked through the window. My phone was silent. Still no apology. Still no message from Elaine asking if my face was okay. Still no call from Graham admitting he had gone too far. That was fine. By morning, they would stop wondering whether I was hurt and start wondering how much power they had handed to the daughter they treated like an outsider. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, a black delivery van rolled through the snow-covered driveway of the mountain lodge, carrying a box wrapped in deep red paper with a gold ribbon tied neatly around the lid. From the outside, it looked like a Christmas gift. That was the point. Brandon found it first because, according to the camera notification on my phone, he had opened the front door in a robe, probably expecting some expensive apology from me. I watched the silent footage from my desk as he picked up the box, turned it around, and carried it inside with the same entitled confidence he had worn the night before. I did not need audio to know what he was saying. He was probably laughing. He was probably telling Graham and Elaine that I had come crawling back. For most of my life, that was exactly what I had done. I fixed what they broke. I apologized when they hurt me. I paid when Brandon failed. But that morning, the box did not contain forgiveness. It contained consequences. Inside was a formal notice ending their right to live in the lodge, giving them 30 days to vacate. Beneath that was a letter from Victor announcing the immediate review of every dollar invested into Brandon's vision clinics. Under that was a notice suspending his company credit cards, administrative access, and investor-backed credit line pending a forensic audit. Then came the USB drive. On it was security footage from the dining room camera that Brandon never realized was connected to the lodge system I paid for. The video showed him slapping me. It showed him yelling, "What are you, blind?" It showed Elaine running to clean his sleeve instead of checking my face. It showed Graham ordering me to apologize or leave. And at the bottom of the box was a small stack of invoices, already marked with yellow tabs. They were not the full evidence yet. They were just enough to let Elaine know I had started looking. My phone began vibrating 11 minutes after the package was opened. First Graham, then Elaine, then Brandon, then Graham again. I let every call ring until it died. A minute later, Brandon tried to use his company card to order a last-minute luxury watch online. The fraud alert came straight to the dashboard Tessa had already helped me monitor. Declined. Then he tried a second card. Declined. Then he tried to log into the clinic management portal. Suspended pending audit. That was when the panic truly began. The cameras showed him pacing across the living room, shouting into his phone. Elaine sat at the dining table with the invoice copies spread in front of her, one hand pressed to her mouth. Graham kept reading the lodge notice again and again, as if the words might change if he stared long enough. I knew the exact moment they realized the truth. They were not guests in a family home. They were occupants in a property I owned. Brandon was not a self-made businessman. He was operating a company built with my money and my guarantees. Graham was not the head of the family empire. He had been living inside the safety net of the daughter he had just thrown out into the snow. The lodge did not go dark. I did not cut off their heat or leave them in danger, because I was not like them. Basic power, water, and heating stayed on. But every luxury system connected to my accounts was suspended. The wine cellar lock no longer opened. The private garage app stopped working. The streaming panels, smart entertainment system, and premium concierge service all went offline. The house they loved showing off suddenly became a quiet, ordinary building full of frightened people. By noon, Victor emailed me confirmation that all notices had been served properly. By 2 o'clock, Brandon had left 34 missed calls and one voice message calling me insane. By 4 o'clock, Elaine sent a text that said, "We need to talk as a family." I stared at those words for a long time. Family. They only used that word when they needed something from me. I put the phone face down and waited for Tessa's audit team to finish the first review, because the package had scared them. But what came next would do far more than scare them. It would expose them. 2 days after Christmas, I sat in a glass conference room at my office with Tessa across from me, and a stack of files between us that seemed to get heavier every time she turned a page. Tessa had been my closest friend since college, but in that room she was not speaking to me like a friend. She was speaking like a forensic accountant who had seen something ugly and did not want to soften it. Her laptop was connected to the screen behind her, and the first thing she showed me was a list of vendor payments from Brandon's clinics. On paper, the money had gone to suppliers for specialty lenses, diagnostic equipment, renovation materials, and medical inventory. In reality, half those vendors did not exist. Some addresses led to empty office suites. Some tax numbers were fake. Some invoices repeated the same language down to the exact typo, just with different amounts. Tessa clicked to the next slide, and my stomach tightened. Payments labeled emergency optical equipment had been redirected to accounts connected to Brandon. Renovation funds had been used at casinos, luxury hotels, ski resorts, and online sports betting platforms. Patient refund reserves had been drained. Insurance reimbursements had been moved into shell accounts. He had not been struggling. He had been stealing. I sat very still while Tessa explained that Brandon had created a pattern of false billing through the clinics, then covered gaps with more false invoices. The clinics looked successful because he kept opening new locations with money I supplied, but behind the polished waiting rooms and expensive branding was a financial sinkhole. He had been using my investment to pay old debts, create the appearance of growth, and fund a lifestyle he had no right to live. I wanted to be shocked, but some part of me had known. The constant emergencies, the sudden requests, the way Elaine always appeared before Brandon did, asking me not to be too hard on him. Then Tessa opened a smaller folder and her expression changed. "Audrey," she said quietly, "this part is going to hurt." She slid the folder toward me. Inside were authorization forms for several large transfers that should never have been approved. At the bottom of each one was Elaine's signature. Not once, not twice, over and over again. My mother had signed off on false emergency expenses, personal reimbursements, and budget overrides that allowed Brandon to keep draining the clinics. She had not merely ignored what he was doing. She had helped him hide it. I stared at her signature until the letters blurred. The slap had been humiliating. Graham's order had been cruel. But this was different. This was not one heated moment at a Christmas dinner. This was a long, deliberate betrayal carried out by people who smiled at me across family tables while using my trust as a bank account. Tessa waited until I could breathe normally again, then showed me the final section of the audit. Brandon owed money outside the business too. Large cash withdrawals matched payments to private lenders. There were messages in the records from unknown numbers demanding repayment. Some were threatening. Some mentioned deadlines. One message said, You have until New Year's, or we come to the house. That explained the panic in his calls. He was not afraid of losing the clinics. He was afraid because the money flow had stopped, and people far less patient than I was had been waiting for him. I asked Tessa how bad it was. She folded her hands and said, "If we send this to the authorities, he is facing fraud, embezzlement, and possibly insurance-related charges. Elaine could also be investigated for signing those approvals." I leaned back in my chair and looked through the glass wall at my employees moving through the office outside. People who worked honestly. People who earned their paychecks. People who would never get the chances Brandon had wasted. For years, Graham and Elaine told me I was too harsh when I questioned him. Too suspicious. Too cold. Too obsessed with paperwork. Now the paperwork was the only reason I could prove the truth. I told Tessa to keep going and prepare everything in a clean evidence file. Then I called Victor and told him we were no longer dealing with a family dispute. We were dealing with crimes hidden under Christmas smiles and family excuses. That afternoon, Brandon left another message. His voice was no longer arrogant, it was shaking. "Audrey," he said, "unlock the accounts. You do not understand what you are doing." I listened once, saved the message, and forwarded it to Victor. For the first time, I understood that my brother had built his entire life on one belief. He believed I would always absorb the damage. He was about to learn that I was finished being the cushion between him and consequence. 3 days later, the front desk called my office to say there was a disturbance in the lobby. I already knew who it was before the receptionist said the names. Brandon had arrived with Graham and Elaine, and according to the trembling voice on the phone, they were demanding to see me immediately. I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the lobby and saw them below. Graham was standing near the security desk, speaking loudly enough for clients and employees to hear. Elaine had one hand on her chest like she was seconds away from fainting. Brandon paced behind them, his hair messy, his coat half-buttoned, his face pale in a way I had never seen before. He looked less like the confident man who slapped me, and more like someone who had not slept since the money stopped. Graham was telling anyone within earshot that I had abandoned my family at Christmas. Elaine kept saying I was confused and emotional. Brandon just kept repeating that he needed to speak to me alone. I did not let him. I instructed security to bring all three of them to the executive conference room. When they entered, they found me seated at the head of the table. Victor sat to my right with a recording device already visible. Tessa sat to my left with a laptop open and the evidence file ready. That was the first time Brandon hesitated. He had expected tears. He had expected guilt. He had expected the version of me who always lowered her voice to keep the family from becoming embarrassed in public. That woman was not in the room anymore. Graham started first, using the same stern tone he had used at the dinner table. "Audrey, this has gone far enough. You are punishing your mother on Christmas week because of one argument." I looked at him without blinking. "One argument?" I asked. Elaine immediately began crying, saying she had barely slept, saying the lodge felt like a prison, saying neighbors were asking questions. Brandon slammed both hands on the table and shouted, "Stop playing games and turn the accounts back on. I need access today." His desperation filled the room. Graham turned to him sharply, as if only then realizing his son was not angry about pride. He was afraid of something. I pressed a button, and the screen behind me lit up. First came the video from Christmas dinner. The slap. The silence. Graham opening the door for me to leave. Elaine cleaning Brandon's sleeve. No one spoke while it played. Then I showed the lodge deed. Then the signed occupancy agreement. Then the investment contract. Brandon looked away. Graham's jaw tightened. Elaine whispered my name like she wanted to stop me before I reached the part she feared most. I continued. Tessa brought up the fake invoices, one after another. Specialty lenses never ordered. Equipment never delivered. Renovations never completed. Transfers approved by Elaine. Withdrawals linked to gambling platforms and private lenders. The longer the slides continued, the smaller my family looked. Brandon tried to say I had misunderstood the business. Tessa calmly explained that the audit trail was clear. Elaine tried to say she signed what Brandon put in front of her because she trusted him. Victor asked whether she wanted to make that statement formally on record. She stopped crying immediately. Graham leaned forward, his voice weaker now. Audrey, please. We can handle this privately. This is a family matter. That sentence finally made me stand. No, I said. A family matter is forgetting a birthday. A family matter is arguing over dinner. Fraud is not a family matter. Embezzlement is not a family matter. Assaulting me in front of witnesses is not a family matter. Brandon's face twisted with rage, but fear kept him in his chair. I placed two options on the table. They could leave the lodge within the remaining notice period, return all company property, cooperate fully with the audit, and stop contacting my employees. Or Victor would deliver the evidence file to the Economic Crimes Unit before the end of the day. Elaine reached for Graham's arm. Brandon stared at the screen like he could burn the evidence away with his eyes. For once, none of them had a command that worked on me. No guilt, no shouting, no mention of blood. Victor closed the folder and told them security would escort them out. As they stood, Brandon leaned toward me and whispered that I had no idea who I was dealing with. I looked at him and said, "For once, Brandon, neither do you." When the door closed behind them, I exhaled slowly. My hands were shaking under the table, but not from fear, from release. They had come to break me down. Instead, they walked out knowing I could bury every lie they had built. The next week turned the lodge into something none of them recognized. Not because the rooms changed, but because the truth had finally moved in and sat with them at every meal. Brandon no longer pretended to be in control. He spent most of his time locked in his room, arguing in low, frantic bursts over the phone. Graham paced the halls reading the same legal notice again and again, searching for a loophole that was not there. Elaine moved through the kitchen like a ghost, sometimes crying, sometimes snapping at Graham, sometimes defending Brandon even after everything she had seen. She still wanted to believe there was an explanation that would make him her golden boy again. But the outside world was closing in. The clinic staff began calling about frozen payroll access. Vendors demanded payment. Patients complained that appointments were being canceled. Then the private messages started reaching Brandon more often. One night, according to the security logs later reviewed by Victor, Brandon received 6 calls between midnight and 2 a.m. After the last call, he walked through the house barefoot, checking rooms like a thief. The irony was almost too perfect. For years, Graham and Elaine had accused me of being cold because I protected my finances with contracts and safes. But they had raised a son who knew exactly where they hid everything. Around 3 in the morning, Brandon entered their bedroom while they slept. Elaine had kept a small lockbox under the bed for emergencies. Inside were cash envelopes, jewelry, old documents, and the few valuables they had not already sold or borrowed against. Brandon knew the code because Elaine had trusted him with it years before. He opened the box and took everything: cash from their retirement savings, Graham's anniversary watch, Elaine's diamond earrings, a gold bracelet that had belonged to her mother, even a folder of personal identification papers he thought might help him disappear. He left behind a note written on the back of a Christmas card. "I am sorry. I will pay it back when I fix this." That was all. In the morning, Elaine's scream echoed through the lodge. Graham found her on the floor beside the empty lockbox, clutching the note with both hands. At first, he thought I had sent someone to seize their property. Then he read Brandon's handwriting. Something in him collapsed, not dramatically, not loudly. He just sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the empty box while Elaine sobbed that Brandon would never do this unless he was desperate. That was the tragedy of Elaine. Even when her favorite son robbed her, she still tried to make his betrayal sound like a circumstance instead of a choice. Brandon was gone. His phone was off. His car was missing. And the parents who had thrown me out for brushing against his jacket were left with nothing because the son they protected had emptied their last safety net. The 30th day arrived under a gray winter sky. The county officers came first, followed by the property team Victor had arranged. Everything was legal, documented, and calm. That made it worse for Graham and Elaine. There was no dramatic fight to win. No emotional speech to change the outcome. They had signed the agreement. They had violated it. They had ignored the notice. Now the lodge was being returned to its owner. I arrived 20 minutes later and parked near the front gate. I did not go inside. I did not need to walk through those rooms to know what was ending. Graham and Elaine stood near the driveway with a few suitcases, 2 plastic bags, and faces that looked 20 years older than they had at Christmas dinner. When Graham saw my car, he hurried toward me with the desperate hope of a man who had mistaken my kindness for an endless resource. He knocked on the passenger window. "Audrey, please," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. "Your brother took everything. We have nowhere to go." Elaine stood behind him, crying into her gloves. I kept my hands on the steering wheel. I did not lower the window. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I knew one open window would become one more attempt to pull me back into the role they had assigned me. Victor stepped between Graham and the car, holding a folder and a small card. He explained that temporary housing information, storage details, and a basic relocation stipend had been arranged from funds not connected to Brandon's companies. That was more than they deserved, but it was enough for me to remain who I was without becoming who they were. Graham looked at the card like it insulted him. Elaine asked if I could at least speak to her. I looked at her through the glass and remembered her wiping Brandon's sleeve while my cheek burned. I remembered her signature on the fake approvals. I remembered every time she told me to be patient with him because he was family. I did not speak. The gates opened. The officers finished their work. Graham and Elaine stepped back as my car rolled forward into the property they had pretended was theirs. In the rearview mirror, I watched them shrink against the snow with their bags at their feet. They had chosen Brandon over me every time. In the end, Brandon chose himself over them. 3 months later, Brandon was arrested in a motel parking lot 2 states away while trying to sell Elaine's jewelry to a man who turned out to be working with investigators. By then, the evidence file had become much larger than the one Tessa first showed me. The audit connected false invoices, stolen investment funds, insurance irregularities, forged vendor records, and unauthorized transfers from the clinic accounts. Victor had warned me that once we handed everything over, I could not control how far the case went. I told him I understood. For years, my family had asked me to control consequences, soften them, delay them, pay for them, and hide them. I was finished. Brandon's arrest was not dramatic in the way he would have wanted. There was no final speech, no expensive suit, no loyal family surrounding him. Just a tired man in a cheap jacket, carrying a bag full of stolen jewelry and excuses no one believed anymore. The slap at Christmas became part of the record because of the video, but it was almost small compared to everything else he had done. Still, for me, that slap mattered. It was the moment the mask fell off. It was the moment he showed everyone what he believed I was worth. Graham and Elaine moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, far from the mountain views, holiday parties, and social circles they had fought so hard to impress. I heard from Victor that they argued constantly. Graham blamed Elaine for protecting Brandon. Elaine blamed Graham for being too proud to apologize to me sooner. Neither of them blamed themselves completely, because that would have required a kind of honesty they had avoided for decades. But reality did, what my words never could. It forced them to live with the result of their choices. They lost the lodge. They lost the image. They lost the son they had turned into a king. And they lost the daughter who had quietly held the floor beneath their feet. As for the lodge, I did not keep it. The place was beautiful, but beauty can still hold bad memories. Every hallway reminded me of swallowed insults. Every window reminded me of the night I walked out alone. I sold it to a hospitality group for far more than I had originally paid, and for the first time, I did not feel guilty about profiting from something tied to my family. I used part of the money to expand a fund for women starting small businesses in healthcare, technology, and professional services. Not because every woman needs to become rich or powerful, but because too many people are taught to be generous without being taught to protect themselves. I wanted those women to understand contracts, ownership, credit, boundaries, and the difference between helping someone and letting someone consume you. Tessa joined the advisory board. Victor helped create free workshops on basic business protections. I began speaking to young founders about the lessons I had learned the painful way. Never let guilt replace good judgment. Never let family pressure erase legal clarity. Never confuse peacekeeping with love. And never allow someone to call you cruel simply because you finally stopped making their life easier at your own expense. People sometimes ask whether I regret not opening the car window that day. I do not. I regret waiting so long to close the door. That is the truth no one likes to say out loud. Toxic families do not always look toxic from the outside. Sometimes they smile in holiday photos. Sometimes they sit around expensive tables. Sometimes they say the word family while using you as a wallet, a shield, and a scapegoat. But real family is not built on fear, humiliation, or one person's endless sacrifice. Real family requires respect. It requires accountability. It requires care that moves in both directions. What happened to Brandon was not revenge in the childish sense. I did not destroy an innocent person. I stopped protecting a guilty one. What happened to Graham and Elaine was not random cruelty. It was the natural result of choosing appearances over truth and favoritism over fairness. My life now is quieter. I have friends who ask how I am and actually listen to the answer. I have work that matters. I have mornings where my phone is not full of emergencies created by people who never planned to thank me. Peace felt strange at first because I had spent so long confusing chaos with connection. But peace is not empty. Peace is the sound of your own life finally belonging to you. So if you are listening to this, and someone in your life keeps hurting you, then asks you to forgive them because of blood, history, or guilt, remember this. Forgiveness does not require access. Kindness does not require surrender. Love does not require you to stand still while someone destroys you. Sometimes the most valuable lesson you can learn is that walking away is not weakness. Sometimes it is the first honest act of self-respect you have ever given yourself. And if you were in my place, after being slapped, humiliated, used, and betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you, would you have opened that car window? Or would you have driven through the gate and finally chosen yourself?